On June 14th, a fishing boat en route to Italy from Libya with estimated 400 to 700 migrants capsized off the southern coast of Greece. At least 78 people died and hundreds more were feared dead in one of the deadliest shipwrecks in the Mediterranean in recent years. These migrants are mostly men from Afghanistan and Pakistan. Less than 2 weeks later, on June 27th, a French police officer shot and killed a teenager of North African descent after he failed to comply with an order to stop his car. Following the incident, violent riots broke up across France. In the first 6 nights alone, 5,000 cars were set on fire, 1,000 buildings were damaged, and more than 3,000 protesters were arrested. 5 days later, on July 2nd, Germany's ADF party, an anti-immigration party, won a full-time mayor's election for the first time ever. This came a week after the party won its first ever district council election. What do these events say about how Europe is dealing with arguably the greatest challenge facing its future? Is there still time for Europe to defuse the ticking time bomb before it's too late? I'm David Wu, a former Wall Street strategist with a 20-year track record of making actionable predictions about major global change. The Greek philosopher Pythagoras famously said that choices are the hinges of destiny. Choices are decisions. Some decisions have an irreversible impact on the future. One such decision was the British response to the Syrian civil war. On December 17, 2010, a Tunisian fruit seller, after having had the wares of his roadside stand confiscated by a municipal inspector, doused himself with gasoline and set himself afire. This set off protests by the unemployed, trade unionists, human rights activists, and students that quickly spread across the Arab world. The movement came to be known as the Arab Spring. In Syria, protests calling for the removal of President Bashar al-Assad were violently suppressed. This soon led to an armed conflict in the Syrian civil war. In August 2012, following an alleged chemical weapon attack that killed 1,429 people, Barack Obama sought to build international support for a military intervention in the war. However, after the British Prime Minister David Cameron failed to secure parliamentary approval for participation in the intervention, Obama grew cold feet. Without America's most important ally, Obama decided to remit the matter to Congress, where it was safely buried. The British decision sealed the fate of the Syrian opposition. The Syrian opposition was fragmented and lacked the military training and materiel to topple the Assad government. And by 2014, these rebels were also having to fight the Islamic State that started to expand in Syria in the previous year. The inaction of the West emboldened the Syrian government that intensified its attack on the rebels. And in 2015, refugees fleeing Syria surged. That year, over 1 million refugees and migrants, including also those from Afghanistan and Iraq, crossed the Mediterranean into Europe. This became known as the 2015 European migrant crisis. The migrant crisis was the greatest political crisis that the European Union had ever faced. Because for one thing, it resulted in the first ever withdrawal of a member state. The refugee crisis was a defining issue for the pro-Leave camp in the 2016 Brexit vote. More importantly, the refugee crisis exposed the vulnerability of the European Union, with the clash between its founding principle of free movement of people and the wide disparity in appetite for accepting refugees among its members. The result is that Germany ended up with 59% of the Syrian refugees, and Sweden with another 11%. This imbalance is clearly not sustainable. The only question is how long it will take before it begins to threaten the public support for the European project. Sub-Saharan Africa saw its population grow by 2.5% in 2022, the highest among all the regions in the world, and more than 3 times the global average of 0.8% per year. According to projections by the United Nations, Sub-Saharan Africa will contribute more than half of the global population increase between now and 2050. Its population will double in that period, from 1 billion to 2 billion people. The question is whether the economy of Africa will be able to grow fast enough to create jobs for 1 billion more people. Sure, countries like Ethiopia or Rwanda have been among the fastest growing economies in the world over the past 2 decades. But they are the exceptions rather than the rule. Sub-Saharan Africa faces many challenges, including a high level of debt, extreme weather events, and geopolitical risk. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank consider 22 low-income African countries to be either in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress as of November 2022. The frequency of extreme weather events has increased substantially in the region over the past 4 decades, and has increased at a faster pace than in the rest of the world. A 2021 World Bank report highlighted that the frequency of droughts in sub-Saharan Africa nearly tripled in the last 30 years. It's more than quadrupled for storms and has increased more than tenfold in the case of floods. More than a third of the world's droughts and about a fifth of the world's floods took place in the region during the past decade. Then there is geopolitical risk. The IMF recently published a report arguing that economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa could permanently decline if global geopolitical tensions escalate. The report makes a compelling case for why sub-Saharan Africa could stand to lose the most if the world were to split into 2 isolated trading blocs between China on one hand and the United States and the European Union on the other. The IMF estimates that in this scenario, sub-Saharan African economies could experience a permanent decline of up to 4% of real GDP after 10 years. Losses that are larger than what many countries experienced during the global financial crisis. What if the economy of sub-Saharan Africa cannot grow fast enough to absorb 1 billion more people? A reasonable assumption is that poverty, social strife, conflicts will follow. And people will try to leave. Europe, given its proximity, will be their most obvious destination. In 2022, around 330,000 irregular border crossings were detected at EU's external border, an increase of 64% from the previous year. In the first 5 months of this year, the number of detections of irregular border crossings reached 100,000, 12% more than a year ago, and the highest level since 2016. This mainly reflects a 160% increase in arrivals via the central Mediterranean route that accounts for roughly half of the irregular crossings into the EU so far this year. At 50,000, this is the highest number recorded since 2017. Fleeing war, persecution, and poverty in the Middle East and Africa, many refugees and migrants are willing to risk everything for a better life in Europe. In many ways, Libya offers them the most logical pathway to Europe. Libya is close to Europe and has an extended, relatively permeable border to the south, so it is accessible from sub-Saharan Africa. The distance from western Libya to Italy is considerably shorter than from eastern Libya. However, since Libya and Italy signed an agreement against illegal crossings in 2017, migrants departing for Italy from western Libya are frequently intercepted by the Libyan coast guards and sent back. But the Libyan government of Tripoli does not control eastern Libya, that has lately become the jumping off point of choice for refugees and migrants. From $750 to $3,500 apiece, Libyan smugglers will put you on a boat that they say is headed for Italy. Often the boats are not seaworthy and overladen with passengers. Once the boat is in international waters, the smugglers abandon the boats and their passengers to their fate. The lucky ones manage to get on shore undetected. The unlucky ones get stopped by Frontex, the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, and get sent to detention camps for processing. The really unlucky ones never make it to land. The birth rate in the European Union in 2021 was 1.53 live births per woman, compared to 1.66 in the US. This low birth rate means that the European population will be shrinking rapidly without immigration. But the need for immigration is not the same thing as the ability to integrate immigrants, including asylum seekers. Let's take a look at France that have fairly good statistics on the integration of immigrants. The unemployment rate for immigrants is 13% in 2021 versus 8% for the whole population. Studies by INSEE showed that discrimination plays an important part of this disparity, especially for those immigrants from the Maghreb, i.e. West North Africa. 91% of the unemployment rates gap between immigrants from the Maghreb and Frenchmen without migration background cannot be explained by the differences in their profiles and professional trajectories. More importantly, for men who are descendants of immigrants from the Maghreb, in other words, born and raised in France, the unexplained part of the unemployment rate gap remains high at 80%. The fact that discrimination does not diminish much among French-born children of foreign-born parents would suggest integration is very slow. In 2019-2020, 25% of descendants of immigrants aged 18 to 59 declare having experienced unequal treatment against 24% of immigrants. As a result of the slow integration, standard of living does not improve much for the second generation born of two immigrant parents. Immigrant standard of living is 22% lower than that of individuals who are neither immigrants nor descendants of immigrants. But this gap is still 19% for descendants of two immigrant parents. Of course, integration runs both ways. We cannot know whether it is France that integrates immigrants slowly or that people from the Maghreb do not integrate easily. But the question of why does not really matter here. This is because today there are close to 2 million people with Maghreb nationalities living in France. And there are many more who are descendants of immigrants from the Maghreb. What this means is that this is not a small problem that France can still turn a blind eye to. Indeed, as the riots in France over the past week demonstrate, the problem is reaching a tipping point. Anti-immigration parties have been on the rise across Europe in recent years. Marine Le Pen received 41% of the votes in the 2022 French presidential election, up from 34% in the 2017 election. The number of MPs from her party, the National Rally, in the National Assembly increased from just 7 to 89 seats. In the 2022 general election, the Swedish Democratic Party, that campaigned on restricting immigration, won 20% of the seats and became the second largest party in Sweden. In Italy, the Brothers of Italy, the anti-immigration nationalist party, won 26% of the seats in the 2022 general election, the most of any party. In Germany, according to recent polls, the AfD, the anti-immigration right-wing party, is now polling head-to-head with the Social Democrats, and just behind the Christian Democrats. It is very likely that the riots in France that have already spread to Switzerland and Belgium will only increase support for the anti-immigration parties across Europe. It is likely that Europe will be forced to toughen its immigration policies in response. But what won't go away is the problem of migrants and asylum seekers from the Middle East and Africa who are already in Europe. The slowness of their integration is increasing support for the anti-immigration parties. Anti-immigration parties in Europe tend to be also nationalist parties, many of which are also Eurosceptic parties. As these parties gain more power, it will come at the expense of European unity and integration. This will be especially true for Germany, that has been footing a disproportionate share of the cost of keeping the EU together. The next German federal election is not until 2025, and the next French presidential election is not until 2027. However, if by then Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz have not succeeded in easing the social tensions in France and Germany, the financial market will be right to assume that the euro's days are numbered. Am I optimistic? Unfortunately, no. Faster integration requires money and political capital, and there's a shortage of both in France and Germany right now. Faster integration also requires an abandonment of the multicultural ideology of the progressive left that's become an excuse for doing nothing. Given the current extreme political correctness environment, it is difficult to see that happening anytime soon. If you got something out of this program, please hit like and subscribe to my free YouTube channel. Let me know what you think by posting your comments on the video. If you want to learn more about my investment strategy, come visit us at davidwuunbound.com.